This episode is part of a series where I take already published memoir and break down what works and why, and what doesn't work and why. I found that when I'm teaching my memoir method concepts to my writers, they benefit from seeing how these principles play out in memoir that you can find at the bookstore. This month, I'm looking at the memoir Renegade Agency by Andrea Verbanic, and today is part 1. You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about Renegade Agency before we dive into the meat of today's episode. This book is Renegade Agency, a memoir of a family in crisis and the systems meant to protect us. This book was published in December of 2024 and is a self-published memoir. What makes this particular memoir special and meaningful to me is that Andrea was my first memoir client, my very, very first one. And when I got to pre-order her book a year ago, it felt like a true full circle moment. When I started this series on the podcast this year, taking already published memoir, running it through my principles, I knew that at some point I wanted to break down Renegade Agency for you, because not only did I see the rough draft of this memoir, I also know the author and know how committed she is to the process and ultimately to her message and advocacy. And I wanted you to see how you can go from a super rough draft to a published memoir that is being used in college courses and is being disseminated to the people who really need this message and this advocacy work the most. So when Andrea and I worked together, I did not have the refined methodology and frameworks that I do now. But that is the magic of the Memoir Method. You can take any great memoir and the pieces will all still fit. So far, I've been doing this with memoir that I did not work on professionally. Today, I get to do it with one I did work on professionally before I had any of these frameworks in place that I use now. So I can take this memoir that I worked on without the articulated methodology and it still fits. That's how I know that what I have is gold for memoir writers. So Andrea's angle is a fascinating one. She worked for a decade as a social worker. She's married to a police detective, and through a series of very unfortunate events, she found herself falsely accused of child abuse. So Andrea has the CPS social work perspective. She has the law enforcement adjacent perspective and the perspective of being the subject of a child abuse investigation. When I first read her pitch, when she first reached out to me and I asked her, tell me what you're working on, I was already hooked because this is one of those stranger than fiction, nonfiction stories that has the ability to affect real change in real communities. So in this memoir, Andrea takes a very specific experience from her life and narrows in on that story. Some memoir is more sweeping, spans more time, requires you to understand parts of childhood, etc. Andrea's memoir does not. It takes place in a very narrow set of years, and she keeps her storytelling focused on that. Let's talk about the readers for Andrea's memoir. Right from the get-go, Andrea had an intended audience. She wants to use her story to affect change within the civil systems designed to protect families. So her primary audience is industry professionals, CPS social workers, police officers and detectives, doctors, all of the interagency, multiple moving pieces within our civil systems that are technically designed to protect children, to protect families. She's talking to them. So her story is one of interagency failure, and she's speaking to all of them, not out of anger, and that's a really important part of her tone, but out of a deep desire to advocate for families and children most affected by failed systems. So are these mirror readers? I know that in these breakdowns, I talk about mirror readers and window readers. In some way, yes, these readers are mirror readers. So she's writing as a social worker for other professionals in the field. She's also writing as someone who was falsely accused, and she's using her story to advocate for them. So her intended audience, industry professionals, they are also going to be window readers into, guys, this is how these systems affect real people. And I'm telling you that as someone who has lived through hell and back. I am a window reader on all fronts. For window readers, this book is especially insightful because it shows a side of common systems that I'm generally familiar with just from being in the world. I know these systems affect us, and reading this taught me how to be more aware of how these systems operate and how to advocate within them. Andrea never thought that she would be the person who would incorrectly be the prime suspect in a child abuse case. And through her story, she's advocating for better awareness from all citizens. This is not even a calling out of systems, but a calling in. And she wants to assume the best. She does not want to come at her story out of revenge. She wants to improve the system because she is someone who has a lot of inherent privileges within the system, and it still affected her in a really profound way. And so when you think about the families and children who do not have the advantages that Andrea had, the outcome would be devastating, even more devastating than it was for Andrea. And so she's using her experience as a vehicle for advocacy and change. So talking about her thesis, I actually know the ins and outs of Andrea's thesis. I know which ones we had spitballed at the beginning. I know how we weeded them out and refined what we ended up with. And I actually use this as a case study inside of my Memoir Method program as a way to show writers how to weed out and decide on what would be the most functional and sustainable thesis for their memoir. So as I examine the thesis here in this setting, I'm actually not going to reference the documents that I already have. And I would love instead to pull from the actual reading experience from the memoir. A major part of helping Andrea decide on what her thesis should be was getting clear on her motives for telling her story. Like I've mentioned, a story like hers could very easily be told as a way of getting revenge, telling her side of the story, making sure that the people who hurt her got theirs. It's as some way of holding people accountable in a vengeful way. From the very, very beginning, though, Andrea knew the attitude that she wanted to take into the writing and editing process. She has rightfully worked through a lot of anger and frustration with this process. She does not bring that into the manuscript. And as you are writing about your own hard things, I advise you to write from a place of healing as much as possible. Write from the scar, not from the open wound. And Andrea does this really, really well. And that was a major factor that influenced the thesis that we settled on for her work. She didn't want to get even. And the calling out that she did wasn't about the person who wronged her or the people who wronged her. It was out of, hey, this behavior is happening inside these different systems and it shouldn't be. So let's call that out and make adjustments and changes so that what happened to me doesn't happen to anybody else. She wanted to call out the systemic blind spots and failures more than the specific people who failed her. She was very intentional in using pseudonyms for every person because she did not, again, want the story to be about them and how they failed her, but about how the system is failing the people it's supposed to protect. So knowing your motives is a key puzzle piece in being able to name your thesis. The conversation that Andrea wanted to have, and it succeeds in having through her memoir, is about how systems that we trust to protect families and children don't protect families and children. And she uses her experience as its own case study and vehicle in showing us how failed systems affect real people in life-altering ways. Throughout our editing process, we kept that message front and center so that every edit and every rewrite would be anchored into this energy of advocacy. I was really impressed with Andrea when we first connected because it was so important to her to keep her focus on the systems, not on the people. She came into this process with that author mindset already. She knows that her story isn't about her, but it is rather a vehicle for a bigger conversation that needs to be happening. She had that attitude then, and it's amplified even more now that her book is out in the world and she is continuing to advocate for systemic reform. Next week, I'm going to go into the structure behind Renegade Agency and the different elements that we considered as we were reworking her manuscript. I'm going to share some of the ways that we reworked Andrea's initial manuscript and how we took very specific things that were important to her in her storytelling process and made sure that those were amplified and streamlined in the final document. And then in episode 100, that's coming up so soon, I cannot believe it, I'm actually going to be talking with Andrea about the self-publication experience. I cannot wait to hear her insights, and I am just so proud of her. I just have such a feeling of humility and gratitude for being able to work with a writer who is so passionate about what she does in the conversation that she's having. And I cannot wait to bring part of that conversation here to you. You can buy your copy of Renegade Agency through the link in the show notes, and you can find me online on Instagram at Charlotte Jane Writes. You can email me at hello@bookishedits.com. I love to hear from you about what has landed from the podcast, and I love to chat with you about how I can best support you in your story. I do have a couple of open one-on-one memoir development spots, so if that's something that you want to learn more about, if you want me to take your memoir through the process that I did with Andrea, then you can book a free 30-minute call through the link in the show notes. I would love to meet with you. Thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next time. You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Writes. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.